Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Bossler, professor and chair of the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology at Georgia Southern University. We have campuses in 3 locations in Savannah, Statesboro, and Hinesville in Georgia, which is the United States of America. And I was asked to give a presentation on cyber harassment, but within a cybersex context. And when I was thinking about ideas on what I really wanted to present, I thought the most important issue to discuss is how we can improve our legislation around image-based sexual abuse. When we start talking about image-based sexual abuse, it's important to think about all the different technologies that have existed and continue to be created over the last a couple of decades and will continue. We always talk about how these digital technologies are always used for positive purposes, and we start talking about how some of them are used for criminal offending, but I don't think we really talk enough about how almost every digital technology you can think of in the past, right now, or every technology that will be created in the future all has an ability to somehow inflict gender violence against women and children. And it's something that, although we talk about how technology is related to cybercrime, we do not give enough focus on the impact that it has regarding women and children. So a pretty straightforward definition of image-based sexual abuse, it's the threat or actual non-consensual sharing, posting, or dissemination of nude or sexual images. Quite often, in the vernacular, people refer to this as revenge pornography, and a lot of legislation might refer to it as revenge pornography. But as we're going to see in the presentation today, we really shouldn't be referring to it as pornography because it has nothing to do with the idea of it all. It's simply just sexual abuse against women and children. And so a better way to think about image-based sexual abuse is the idea that it is an umbrella term that encapsulates a lot of different types of behavior. Paul et al. Point out that there's 3 different types of behaviors that fall underneath this larger category of image-based sexual abuse, with the first one being the non-consensual taking or creation of nude or sexual images. These are instances where the victim did not even know that their photos or images of themselves being nude were being taken. This could occur through hacking, or quite often also could happen through pictures of film being taken of individuals in public restrooms and similar places. The second type of behavior is what most people would refer more commonly as revenge pornography, which is the non-consensual sharing or distribution of nude or sexual images. And finally, we also have to realize that some of image-based sexual abuse is not just the actual sharing, but it's the threats of it. It's the blackmail of it, trying to get someone to do something that the offender wants by threatening to share these type of sexual images. So throughout this presentation, we should keep this much broader definition of what we mean by image-based sexual abuse. When we talk about the scope of the problem, it's quite challenging because our statistics vary so much by how we define it, the methods that scholars use, the different countries that a lot of these studies occur in, and also the sampling about whether we're talking about grade school, high school, college, or young adult samples. But when we look specifically at non-consensual transmitting victimization, what a lot of people would call revenge pornography, we see that for minors that it seems to range anywhere from 10 to 20% of minors have been victimized, where someone that they trusted with a nude photo of themselves sent it to someone else or showed that picture to someone else without their permission. For adults, it appears that the victimization prevalence is actually lower, somewhere between 1 to 12% possibly. However, when we start talking about perpetration, we see that there's a much higher percentage. That when we quite often talk about the dark figure of crime, these are usually crimes unknown to the police, and we start talking to victims, we start finding out that there's a lot more crime out there. However, when we talk about cybercrime, including image-based sexual abuse, we find out that there's a lot of crime that victims don't know about. So when we talk to offenders, it appears that 12 to 30% of minor and young adult samples have shown or transmitted a sexual image to someone else without the consent of the person who originally provided that picture. That's a pretty shocking statistic. When we look at the impact on victims, we see that the effects can range from emotional to social and economic. And of course, it can lead to some issues such as anxiety or lack of trust and loss of confidence in oneself. But it can really lead to fear, depression, and suicidal ideation. In fact, according to a lot of organizations, it seems that almost a majority of victims will have experienced some type of severe mental health as a result of being a victim of image-based sexual abuse. The social effects can also be including exclusion and alienation, not wanting to hang out with your friends, or actually not wanting to go online, trying to stay away from the abuse. Economic effects can, of course, include court costs, lost jobs, and the amount of bills that can come with all the mental health impact. These effects are both short-term and long-term, with the effects quite often not only ranging in months, but also in the years. When we talk about what we should do about image-based sexual abuse, we quite often only focus on it from a criminological perspective, a very narrow view, but we really need to examine from a much broader perspective. And most scholars out there who are studying who are studying image-based sexual abuse really argue we should study from a feminist approach. And we do that, we can really see the amount of inequality out there and how that leads to patriarchal society. That we really need to look at the offending of image-based sexual abuse, the victimization of it, but also the legal response to it, which is what we're talking about today. And when we start looking at the legal response to it, we start asking questions not about the actions that victims take, but really the actions of the offenders and why society accepts and approves it, such as why is there such a demand for pornography in general? Why is there such a demand for amateur pornography, for different types of gonzo pornography? Why do we put the blame on the victim rather than the offender? Why don't we actually try to do more about this? And quite often when we look at why we don't do more about this, it tells us a lot about our surroundings and the society we live in. So we need to start taking this much more seriously in a feminist perspective as an important way to deal with this, because we won't be able to legislate our way out of it. We really have to do more about gender inequality in general in our society and try to erode the culture of humiliation that exists in general, but especially attacks women and children. When we look at U.S. legislation, we do see that most states have passed what they might call revenge pornography legislation. Only 4 states have not in the U.S.: Wyoming, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Massachusetts. However, most states really only consider it to be a misdemeanor. Some states do consider it a felony, although quite often they have a lot of restrictions on it. A lot of states simply try to deal with image-based sexual abuse by its current child pornography or blackmail statutes. When we look at what really needs to occur in the U.S. and very possibly around the world, but this presentation is really only focused on the U.S., we need to move away from certain terms. Words matter. We have to move away from phrases such as revenge pornography and move to phrases such as image-based sexual abuse. As pointed out earlier, this has nothing to do with pornography. It is a way to humiliate and try to control women and children through sexuality and to try to keep them in a certain position in patriarchal societies. In addition, we need to try to have our legislation not refer to the intent of the actor. In some cases, it might be about revenge or harassment or humiliation, but there's many other reasons why image-based sexual abuse continues to occur. Therefore, the focus really needs to be on the act itself, the fact that it's the non-consensual transmission or showing of these images. Then in the end, it doesn't matter why the person did it. It makes us focus on the offender and the act rather than the sexuality of it. And also it makes sure that we do not have to try to make the victim defend their actions. So instead of asking the victim why they took the picture, why did they share it with someone else, and it also asks whether there was consent to share. Instead, it makes us focus on the offender. Why do you have the photo? Were you allowed to have this photo? Why did you choose to share it? Did you explicitly have consent to show this picture to others, and can you prove it? And many examples of good legislation in the U.S. can be found on the website of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, which is a nonprofit organization. And when we started looking at some of their models, they show some examples at both the federal and also the state level. So when we look at the federal level, for one of their examples, in case if the U.S. wants to improve their statutes, or if another nation wants to try to follow the steps of the U.S. a little bit, we see the first half of this model really kind of fits the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act in the U.S. about how the internet and electronic devices and wires should not be used for illegal purposes if it's going to cross state, federal, or international boundaries. But when we look at the second half of the statute, we see some important aspects. First, it's that whether a person can be identifiable and whether they can be connected with any type of sexually explicit conduct. Then it also includes whether any type of naked genitals or nipples are exposed. Those two things are important to distinguish because quite often a lot of revenge pornography statutes only focus on whether the person is identifiable, but also whether any part of the image shows them nude. And if it doesn't show any part of themselves nude, it's very possible the statute does not apply. So you could have a fully clothed person who's identifiable, who's participating in oral sex, and revenge pornography statutes would not cover that. Or if there's something else, such as if the victim is shown being is simply having been sex or rape, but at no part, if their sexual organs not being shown, the revenge pornography statute might not actually cover. So it's important that these statutes also include when the person is clothed, but it's clear that the person is engaging in any type of sexual activity. And then it's also, as we point out, there's no intent anywhere in the statute, and whether the offender had knowledge of or reckless disregard for the fact that the depicted person did not consent to the distribution. When we look at examples for state law, it's also quite similar as well. For an example of if any state wants to improve, there's no discussion of intent in these statutes. And once again, it covers whether the person is participating in any type of sexual act or whether there is any type of nudity shown in there. And when we look at these statutes, they provide very good definitions. We can see how inclusive the words disclose mean, or image, or what's all involved in intimate parts or sexual acts. The Cyber Civil Rights Organization, as I mentioned before, it's a nonprofit organization in the U.S. that was founded by a victim of revenge pornography, and their website has been quite instrumental in the passing and endorsement of some of these improvements of these statutes. They point out that the Illinois model, or the laws that Illinois has, is a pretty good statute in order for other states to improve what they're currently doing. They provide 7 reasons. Because of time, I'll quickly go over some of these. But when we look at the Illinois statute, they do not talk about motive. Selfies can be included because it does not matter where the picture came from. We should not be blaming victims. In fact, a majority of non-consensual pornography starts off as selfies. So the real issue, once again, is the offenders sharing this information, sharing these images without consent. The Illinois model has strong punishments associated with it. It is not only just focused on nudity, but once again, sexual acts that it's clear the person is participating in and the person is identifiable. It's also very important because it also focused on downstream distributors. Some statutes only focus on the very first person who shares the image without consent. But it's important that statutes focus on whether a reasonable person would know that they should be sharing and further showing these pictures to other individuals. So downstream distributions of these images would be illegal as well. It honors the First Amendment, meaning that it allows for legal pornography. It also allows for people to report these images to the police. It allows law enforcement to share these photos with other law enforcement agencies in order to do investigations. And also specifically discusses doxing, where quite often we see over half of these types of illegal images provide images and information on the victim. So it makes it illegal for individuals to contact these individuals, to contact the victims and to harass them. We should point out that this is also very relevant for South Korea as well. Over the last several years, there's been quite a few international cases of revenge pornography, or also MOCA, the illegal filming of people with hidden cameras. And although there has been some statutes passed over the last couple of years where distribution of revenge pornography is up to 3 years of prison, and if it's actually filmed illegal, it might be up to 10 years, we see that the fines associated with these offenses are quite low. That in U.S. dollars is only $4,500 or possibly $9,000 even for a felony. And then we talk about MOCA offenses. Some estimates show that maybe only 2% of them are actually in the prison sentences. And so this is just not a U.S. issue of not taking this issue seriously enough, but it seems like many countries could improve their enforcement of this. So how do we move forward? In the last couple of minutes I have, how do we move forward with this? It's important not only to improve our legislation like I've been talking about, we also need to desperately improve our training and funding for law enforcement to deal with these. There's simply not enough focus on it for law enforcement and prosecutors to examine these issues more. And part of this training actually might focus on the impact of the victims. If law enforcement understands how significant that these crimes are to victims, they actually might want to get involved more. Law enforcement needs to learn more about the referrals that they can give to the victims, such as victim advocacy referrals. The officer and the victims also have to know more about what options they have. So if a victim asks a police officer, "What can I do?" a police officer has to be able to know what they can tell the victim, or at least refer them to the correct agency. And as I pointed out, if we really tackle this from a feminist perspective, we realize we can't deal with this simply through legislation, but we really have to do more about gender inequality and try to deal with that. And that actually have the largest impact in the short and long term, and not just trying to change some wording with legislation. And finally, last slide, I just want to point out that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. As I've been talking about, there's many organizations out there, but one good example of a nonprofit organization that's making a big difference is the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. And they have many good statutes that I've been talking about. Any person who's interested in this can actually read reports. They can look at the statutes for every state in the US. They can look at those model statutes, and they can also find out how they can become involved if they want to try to make a difference with this. So once again, thank you for inviting me to give a presentation on this really important issue. And I'll reserve questions. You can either email me, or when the presentation goes live, I'll also be more than happy to talk about this and answer any questions. Thank you for your time.